On behalf of the team of Cornell Cooperative Extension Regional Dairy Specialists and PRODAIRY, we would like to welcome you to day 2 of our Net Zero for New York Dairies program. My name is Casey Havicus. I will be your host today, and I am one of the dairy management specialists at Cornell Cooperative Extension on the North Country Regional Ag team. Dr. Quirine Ketterings is a professor in the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University. She is also involved in the Nutrient Management SPEAR program. And Dr. Ketterings is going to be joined today in her presentation by Kirsten Workman. Kirsten is a nutrient management and environmental sustainability specialist with Cornell PRODAIRY program. So your slides look good, Quirine, and I think everything looks good on our end if you want to go ahead and get started.
Excellent. Thanks, Casey. Yeah, Kirsten and I are going to co-present this morning, and particularly focusing on innovative crop strategies for reducing and sequestering greenhouse gases. Our talk is really focused on management strategies. Not that we believe that we have the solution to all of this, but just to give some overview of management strategies that could help us improve our greenhouse gas footprint on farms. We're going to kick it off with talking a little bit about the greenhouse gases, and the main focus then is the management strategies in terms of crop production practices and ways in which we can evaluate if we are on the right track and learn about our management decisions over time, including C's and T's, field balances, and farm imbalances. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kirsten to kick us off.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. So just real quickly, and again, thanks. I'm Kirsten Workman, new to PRODAIRY. So glad to be here today with you folks. So just a quick review over the sort of sources and sinks of greenhouse gases on US farms. Quirine just released a new fact sheet, number 119. We'll share some links with you shortly about this topic, but a little bit of review from yesterday and today. The main emissions from farms are coming from methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. And Olivia, one of Dr. Kettering's postdocs, has put together this great diagram for us here that just sort of shows some of the sources and sinks of those greenhouse gases. You can see on that pie chart on the right that those match up pretty closely. The sources of gas also relate pretty closely with the sources on the farm. So field management practices tend to be contributing to nitrous oxide, whereas you heard from Peter, manure storage, as well as we'll hear later today, the actual cows themselves contributing to the methane portion, and then a fairly small portion coming from carbon dioxide. And then of course our sinks would be in sort of our forested areas and hedgerows, as well as in the soil itself, as well as plants and bacteria in the soil fixing nitrogen. Go ahead. So again, this slide is, we're talking about the Dairy Net Zero initiative, and we can see here that, all dairy farms are not independent systems, right? They all work very closely together, and one influences the other. So we can't really separate them, although, it's more convenient to do so in a graph or a picture, but these all sort of play off each other. But today, Dr. Ketterings and I are going to focus sort of on the feed and crop production changes that we can make, which clearly make up a large portion of the dairy greenhouse gas footprint. So go ahead. One of the first things we need to do when we look at this idea of a footprint of a farm is we need to kind of set the boundaries of when we count something towards the farm and when that something gets counted, downstream or upstream. So there's a link here to an article that does a really good job of describing this for farms. And you can see there's some sort of upstream activities in terms of these things coming from off farm. So our purchased electricity, feed, fertilizer, any of those inputs that are coming from off farm but are being utilized on the farm to produce crops or feed animals or what have you. And then we have the direct sort of on-farm activities. And of course, those two relate to each other, which, we're going to talk a lot today about how do we reduce those off-farm inputs and be more efficient with the resources on the dairy farm. And then anything that then leaves the farm gets counted by those downstream folks. So, transport and things like that the milk itself, any animals, energy would be counted towards the footprint of the processor or the purchaser. Go ahead. So one of the big things we talk about when we think about fields is carbon sequestration. And that is, the carbon that we can capture from the atmosphere and get it added to soil or trees or plants. Luckily, in trees, we'll talk a little bit about this in the next couple slides, but, trees are really the long-term storage. That's sort of our best bet that we can really quantify. So luckily in New York State and the Northeast in general, we have lots of trees and hedgerows. So this is sort of a distinct advantage that we have. The other benefit to that is that it has some other sustainability metrics that we'll talk about if you look at the next slide. So in addition to this carbon sequestration, our forest lands and hedgerows create quite a bit of biodiversity. And of course, dairy farms are not only being managed and measured for our ability to reduce, greenhouse gases, but also how do we increase other sustainability metrics. And so if you look at this picture, in addition to trees, we also see a diversity of habitats and crops on the ground as well, which I think also gives us an advantage with our grasslands, our different crop types, because we're growing forage crops, and as well as our annual crops along with those. So, looking at these other, these greenhouse gas emission metrics and management practices will also have a lot of benefits to some of these other sustainability measurements as we go down the road. So then we think about carbon sequestration and soil health, and we talk a lot about this in our part of the world, this world, when we talk about crop production, because we're dealing so directly with the soil itself. And so, we talk a lot about how do we improve soil carbon storage with soil health practices. And this is a good thing to be talking about. Right now, it's a less permanent form of carbon sequestration. And quite frankly, we're trying to figure out what this carbon storage capacity and actual amounts of storage we're accomplishing through some of those practices. And so Dr. Ketterings will talk about a project that's happening across the country, but also here in New York, where we're trying to put measurements to those soil health practices so that we can better quantify what those benefits are. But regardless, building soil health is very important, not only for greenhouse gas emissions, but also for increasing soil fertility, improving water storage during droughts. And we think about climate also being more resilient to those weather events, improving infiltration and reducing erosion during these extreme participation events. So, having soil health really does add to the soil's resiliency. And there's, different ways we can measure that, but we definitely need to be, paying attention. So we'll talk a little bit about, those practices that we can touch on and that we know now are working, and then we'll kind of move towards then how do we quantify what the benefit is. A lot of this conversation for the rest of today is going to focus on nitrogen, and as you could see from the pie chart we showed earlier, that there's very good reason for that. So it aligns quite carefully not only with soil health management practices, but also some of our basic nutrient management principles. So again, looking at the soil itself, when we reduce tillage, I want to reiterate that reducing tillage is a benefit for a few reasons. One is not only are we keeping that soil organic matter intact and reducing the emission from pulling the soil apart and letting it be released, but we're also reducing the fuel used to get our crops established. So we're hopefully utilizing less diesel and fuel combustion in the production of our cropping systems. Keeping the ground covered through cover cropping and double cropping and good crop rotations and having perennial crops is another benefit. Again, helping reduce erosion is also keeping that soil organic matter, where a lot of that carbon is getting taken up on the soil surface and not being washed off and lost. And then making the most out of nutrients already on the farm, offsetting those sort of upstream inputs to the farm, as well as being more economically efficient and putting those fertilizer nutrients, especially nitrogen, putting them on the crop when we need them and really optimizing production is going to be key. And we'll talk about how we do that. So you'll hear this, a few times today during our presentation, but we don't want to be applying nutrients in excess of the crop needs, right? So if we're putting nutrients that can't be pulled up by the crop, right, they'll be lost. If we don't do that, they can't be lost. Sometimes you hear that maybe we should just apply less nitrogen in general to our crops and just accept a lower yield. That necessarily is not a good thing either, right? So if we have unhealthy, non-thriving crops, regardless of if they're perennial, annual, what have you, they're going to create a leaky system. And so if you have, small root systems, struggling plants, you're going to lose nutrients no matter how you look at it. So really the key, right, is if we can optimize yield and quality of our homegrown feed, that is a good thing. It's good for the farmer's bottom line. It's good for efficiencies. It's good for not having losses of those nutrients to the environment. And then we can maximize the crops being grown on each acre, thereby also reducing the need for off-farm fertilizers, hopefully, but also off-farm feed inputs in the form of, grain or other forages being brought to the farm. Okay, so we're going to dive now into some of the management strategies and tools. And again, remembering that we're going to kind of focus on nitrogen here, but there's lots of other benefits as well. So the first thing is to measure yields. So this seems pretty basic, but it's actually really, really important. Yields in New York and the Northeast in general are variable. They're variable by soil type, they're variable by topography, they're variable by, weather and moisture content. And often we see farms actually looking at like their whole yield for the farm, right? Like how much yield went into the bunk that year. And while that's a good start, right, that doesn't get us where we need to be. So if you use those whole farm numbers, they can be accurate. And when you're doing whole farm balances, that's useful, but it's not very precise. And when we're talking about losses, we want to be precise because, even if you put the right amount of nitrogen for the whole farm, if you put it in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're still going to experience those losses. And then for other management strategies, we sort of, to work, we need to really know. So there's lots of ways to get there. You can see here, each farm has fields that will yield below the farm average, and they'll have fields that yield above the farm average, right? So again, looking at that whole farm versus field by field. And even now we're able to get into the parts of fields that yield differently. So some fields are going to have very stable yields over time, and others are going to be variable with weather or conditions and inputs applied. So when you measure yield, you can get a better sense of really what your crop needs are and what is limiting your growth potential. And so you'll see why that's important too. Lots of ways to get there, right? So here's a fact sheet where we talk about measuring corn silage yield. We're sort of on, in a new era where more and more our producers have these really highly precise yield monitor systems. And Dr. Ketterings and her group are doing really amazing things with those data to help us get a handle on this, but it doesn't have to be fancy and it doesn't have to be high tech, right? Like going back to basic agronomic sort of farm management of like weighing loads, tallying those loads for each field, doing yield checks in the field, just sort of getting a better handle on which farms yield what every year can help us start to make better and better management decisions. Right, so then once we can get a better handle on what the yields are from field to field, then we can start to get a sense of what is limiting our yield. And if it isn't our nitrogen inputs, for example, adding more fertilizer to that field is not going to fix the problem, right? So if you can't fix what's limiting the yield, then we need to reduce those fertilizer applications. Otherwise, if nitrogen wasn't our limiting factor, let's say it was compaction or moisture or something else, or pH, let's say, and we fertilize for a much higher crop that couldn't take up that nitrogen, we're going to see losses. So let's reduce those inputs and not fertilize for a 25-ton crop if we're actually more in real life going to get a 15-ton crop off that field. So then that brings us a little bit also to credits, right? So if we're going to reduce our reliance and our imports of off-farm fertilizers and materials, then we need to make sure that we're really starting with those on-farm sources of nutrients. And in nitrogen in particular, that's very important. So before we even get to like putting manure on a field, if we can look at our rotation credits, then we can start to get a handle on the sort of first deduction of how much nitrogen needs to be applied. So taking rotation credits basically for the net corn crop after is important to do. So if most of us that grow crops or help folks grow crops know that first year corn after alfalfa or hay is always the cheapest corn to grow, right? You really basically only need starter nitrogen. If you're following a crop like soybeans, you can assume a 30-pound credit. Similarly, if you're getting your cover crops planted in a timely manner or starting to look at things like legumes, you can get even higher with 70 or 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's just right off the top before we even start thinking about how much manure we're going to be able to put on and credit for that. And one of the things that, if reducing, these off-farm inputs starts really right here. And this allows the farm to then control more of their carbon footprint and their nutrient footprint and all of those things. And so to do this and maximize our crop rotations, we really then need to make sure that we're rotating crops, right? So we need to be following corn after some of these other crops in order to really maximize that credit. It's often a hard decision to make. If you have a good yielding hay or alfalfa field, it's hard to convince a producer that the nitrogen credit is worth rotating, and vice versa. If you've got a field that's well suited for corn and we're asking them to seed it down, that can be a hard ask too. But I think if we can really quantify these credits and then actually put that to the nutrient management plan and take the credit will be really important.
So next on our list of management strategies is number 4 here, and that deals with manure. It's already mentioned a number of times, but manure is really a great source of all of the nutrients that a plant will need, including nitrogen. So we want to take credit of. One of the most illustrative examples we have is a study here that we did with Doug Young in his neighborhood Todd Demont in terms of nitrogen fertilizer replacement value of manure. Here are 3 strips where manure was applied, in this case with the nutrient bond, side dressing during the season, compared to 3 strips where manure was not applied. Over the top of that were nitrogen rates, nitrogen side dress rates from 0 all the way to 175 pounds per acre. And you can just look at the colors here and draw your own conclusions immediately. The manure applied did something that benefited crop yield, and it eliminated the need for nitrogen fertilizer in this example. This is what the data looked like. Yellow was where no manure was applied. Green was where manure was applied. The yellow shows us that we needed nitrogen for this location to come up to yield levels. Optimum N rate was somewhere around 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Around here, the green lines where manure was applied showed that any additional fertilizer nitrogen did not result in an increase in yield. That tells us that we can save our fertilizer dollars to a certain extent. This is just one example, how much we need to define with more studies. And it also showed something else, and that's really important here, and it's the difference between the maximum yield we were able to obtain without manure versus the maximum yield we were able to obtain with manure. Manure benefited yield. 2016 showed the higher yields, eliminated N fertilizer needs for this particular example with these rates. 2017 showed the exact same picture, just lower yields because it was an extremely wet year. Management strategy number 5 is now related to manure as well, and more the timing and the methods here. The value of manure is the greatest when we apply those nutrients close to plant uptake of those nutrients. So we want nitrogen to be there when the plants are rapidly taking it up and responding to it. We don't want it to be there in nitrogen form, in nitrate form, when plants cannot take it up. So for the greatest benefits, close to planting or in season. For the greatest benefits as well in terms of nutrient credits from the manure, it is important to get that manure in the soil and mix it with soil. That could be incorporation, that could be injection, obviously pros and cons for both of these approaches. But when we mix the manure with the soil, and it has time to react and interact with each other, the nitrogen credits can be much higher than when we surface apply. Strategy number 6, if fertilizer is needed. Split application of fertilizer. So a little bit at planting as a starter fertilizer and then coming back at side rest time is more efficient in terms of fertilizer needs, nitrogen needs. If you are delayed in the application in that scenario, you might already be compromised. So timing is important. If you are delayed, and this is some results of 3 years of trials that we did on this. If you are delayed in side dressing, you will have given up some yields. So all these blue arrows are pointing downwards. If you side dress at V10, you have created a deficiency already. So it's important to timely split apply the nitrogen to fields that need it. Management strategy 7, consider enhanced efficiency nitrogen sources to protect some of that nitrogen, especially if you are in situations where you do want to apply everything up front or have the surface apply and cannot incorporate. But these things only benefit the bottom line and reduce emissions if they are used when needed. 2 types of fertilizers here, and there's another fact sheet if you want to read up more on these type of materials. Urease inhibitors, if you cannot incorporate the urea containing fertilizer, it will give us a bigger window to capture that nitrogen before it's getting lost. And nitrification inhibitors, if you want to apply up front, but you don't want it to be available in the first 4 to 10 weeks. So 2 different ways of addressing fertilizer efficiency. Strategy 8 is a bit of a collection here. Make use of available tools to see where cuts and applications could possibly be made. This goes back to don't use more nitrogen than we need, but use it where we do need it. How do we know the difference? How do we know when to apply, when not to apply? Well, no perfect solution here, but there are some tools that can get us in the right direction. Taking PSNTs is one way to go. Making sure you know your yields are, so you set accurate target yields is a good way to go. There are models, there are lots of applications with NDVI maps, crop sensors, other tools available right now. Bottom line here is if you have access to them, make use of them, be informed, but also place a check strip or a spot somewhere to double check and get comfortable with what these tools are telling us. Remember, you cannot fertilize yourself out of a drought, and fertilizer can also not compensate if the soil is saturated and there's an oxygen deficiency. With that, we went through our strategies that we wanted to share today in the short time we have to do this. The last 3 items on the list are evaluation tools. So we can use a lot of guidance on how to determine how much fertilizer we really need, how best to credit manure, crop rotations, all of that. If we can lower the overall footprint by better aligning crop needs with what we supply, we have an advantage. But how do we know? The only thing to do to make ourselves a little bit more comfortable with that is to actually measure how we're doing. Cornstalk nitrogen test is one of the options. This is a piece of the stalk taken at the end of the season at harvest time. If that gets analyzed for nitrate and comes back over 2000, we had more nitrogen than the crop needed that year. This is showing the summary for the state of New York over the last many years. A lot of information here, but basically put down the numbers, look at the one excess over 3000, so it's 1000 ppm higher. 23% on a normal year will exceed this value. Samples being submitted. That shows potential. On the other hand, we said don't shorten the crop. These low numbers are also not what we need, so maybe reallocation could be consideration as well. The second evaluation strategy is field balances, and we hope to work with a lot more folks this year on putting those together. What are these things? Well, we basically look at supply fertilizer, manure, rotation credits, soil cycling, soil organic matter, and we compare that to outputs. And in this case, the output is what we harvest with our crop. So for corn silage crop, it is the yield multiplied times the crude protein percentage in that yield. The concept here is that a nitrogen balance directly measured potential for fertilizer loss. The difference is because of fertilizer. And it's based on the fact that any leftover nitrogen, anything we applied in excess of what a crop can use, is susceptible to loss. And we can do these type of calculations now. Here's an example of one of the farms we've worked with, 2 types of nitrogen balances, available nitrogen and total nitrogen. Look at the one on the left here. This is available N, discounting some losses from manure application, because we cannot capture everything. In black is the line that shows crop uptake of nitrogen. In blue is the line that shows nitrogen supply to that crop in this crop here. In the fields, every bar is a field. They're ranked from left, smallest difference between those two lines, to the right, where there is the biggest difference between the two lines. And in this case, we're talking about a 200-pound difference here for those fields on the right. Two things we can learn from here. We can identify the fields where apparently we might have been able to save on some fertilizer, but we can also identify that the fields on the right, most of the farms that we've done this study with, are not nitrogen limited. They have the lowest yield in general, lower than the ones on the left here. So this is an exercise that we can now do as long as you have yield data and you know the application rates for manure. And welcome on the participation for more people to do this. In addition to field balances, also have the opportunity to do whole farm assessments, similar type of concept. We're looking at what comes onto the farm in terms of feed, fertilizer, primarily, and what gets exported in terms of milk and animals, maybe some crops and manure exports. If your whole farm mass balance for nitrogen exceeds 105 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you most likely have opportunities for savings. And I'm saying savings because the balance is primarily driven by the amount of feed and fertilizer purchased. Here's an example of what this looks like for farms that are participating. Here's the nitrogen balance, milk production per acre. The farm in yellow is in the green box. The farm in red far exceeds those values. Both of these farms are producing the same amount of milk per acre. If you are a farm red here, this might raise questions and say, what can we do to lower that? Because most likely we paid for the extra nitrogen. And farms that participate in this for multiple years can use it as a monitoring tool as well, and see if they can get into the blue area or the yellow area. With that, we are back to our outline. We have walked through a number of strategies to address feed production practices, things that could help reduce our footprint. And we have evaluated and measured and talked about some measurement tools.
Yeah, so just reminding folks that, nutrients not implied in excess of the crop needs can't be lost. And in a year like this, where fertilizer prices are very high, I think this will be a fantastic year to put these strategies to the test and really see where we can tighten that up. Again, just a reminder that shorting the crop is not inherently good, and that unhealthy crops equal a leaky system. In addition to that, these greenhouse gas and climate resilient practices are building healthy soils, and healthy soils will also be less leaky systems and result in higher yields. And also this idea of, the dairy farm being in a good position in the fact that they have some control over this ability to increase their homegrown forages, increase the quality of those forages so they can reduce those off-farm inputs and really sort of maximize the inherent advantages of this closed loop system that is a dairy farm. So again, just, the key here, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cropland is really kind of this alignment of the nutrients applied versus what's being taken up. So we don't want to be shorting crops that we think we could be doing better with, but we also don't want to be over applying where we don't need it. This idea about reducing tillage and cover crops, these two things really worked together. We're having less carbon destroyed in the soil, less fuel used to do it. We're then also reducing erosion and keeping the organic matter in the soil where we want it and can take advantage of it. Again, this inherent benefit of a dairy farm of having rotation credits and manure nutrients that we can use to sort of start off with. And the idea of setting realistic yield potentials when we're putting fertilizer rates and being as precise about that as we can, field by field by field. And then really just evaluating, testing, measuring, and doing that at both the field and farm scale, and looking at balances overall, but also in particular parts of the farm where we can do better, and testing that with on-farm research. And with these new precision tools, we're seeing easier and more efficient ways for farms to do that research themselves and work with folks like us to sort of quantify how we're doing. And Dr. Ketterings is going to share a couple projects that are going to help us do that.
And before I share those two projects, just a general invitation for people that are interested in doing on-farm experimentation with tillage, cover cropping, whatever the strategies are that we talked about. Feel free to get in touch. We are looking for participants for the value of manure studies as we move forward this year with the growing season as well. The two projects that Kirsten was referring to are these two. We have management strategies. We know things that are directionally correct, but how do we know actually how well they are doing? How do we know how well farms in New York are doing as well compared to others? The two projects, the one on the left is the Dairy Sustainability Key Performance Indicator project that we're working on. We're getting into the second, wrapping up the second year. This is a study where we do evaluations at the whole farm scale. We work with case study farms and their data and their feedback. We derive nutrient whole farm mass balances, nutrient balances. Started out with the field level. We're now engaging farmers in the field scale levels as well. And we're evaluating a set of field-based assessments tools, greenhouse gas emission tools at the farm level for their relevance to New York, comparing their outputs from one software to another in the hope that we can identify what is most useful for us to use here for the industry. The third aspect of this is the biodiversity assessment, which is an important one as well, not directly related to greenhouse gas emissions. Project on the right is the one that was presented yesterday, the DMI led and Soil Health Institute led project called Dairy Soil Water Regeneration Project. We are one of 8 partners in the project. And in this situation, we are doing field scale assessments. So these are real measurements. We have chambers that we're measuring emissions at the farm level for. The treatments there, the comparisons have to do with tillage practices, particularly move towards more reduced forms of tillage, cover cropping, double cropping type, keeping the ground covered practices for soil health enhancement, and evaluation of manure products, in this case, primarily Sedron solids and DAF solids as two examples of manure products. So on the right, mostly field measurements, direct measurements to help us understand how these things, how our management impacts the emissions. And on the left, it's a lot of software evaluation tools and assessment with data. This is our final slide, invitation to join On-Farm Research Partnership in the state of New York. And the slides with a thank you to everybody that is helping us with these projects, sponsoring partnerships with on-farm research as well, and our contact information.